So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Stuart Judge. Stuart is Emeritus Reader in Physiology at the University of Oxford. After studying physics and mathematics at the University of Kiel, he undertook voluntary service overseas in the Philippines, teaching at Mindanao State University. He obtained his doctorate in neuroscience at the University of Kiel, supervised by Professor Makai, and then held positions at the US National Institutes of Health and the University of Oxford. His research spans the neuroscience of vision, eye movement, and accommodation of the eyes. And Stuart has also been heavily involved in the science-religion dialogue and in encouraging others to relate their faith and their studies, teaching at summer schools on a range of topics, and serving as a member of the Council of Advisors for the Graduate Christian Forum. Today he'll be talking about human science and human dignity. Stuart.
Thank you very much for that gracious introduction, Paul. It's a very dead auditorium for the speaker, so I'd like to first check that everyone can hear me clearly. Thank you very much. I should also perhaps begin by saying that I know I'm not at my best for reasons I won't go into, and also the fact I've just come back from the United States and I've reached an age where flying economy class across the Atlantic is not a pleasure. I want to begin with a personal preamble, especially as quite a number of Donald Mackay's family are here today. I always knew Donald Mackay as Prof. It was through talking to him when I was a student at Kiel that I recovered the Christian faith in which I'd been raised. His family treated me as part of their family. As my own father, also Scots, had died when I was a teenager, I was particularly grateful for his fatherly guidance. In the course of time, he became my PhD supervisor. Now, for those of you who never knew him, I'd like to tell a story to illustrate that while he was an immensely serious man and could appear intimidating, he also had a wonderful sense of humor. And the family must correct me if I've got some of the details wrong here. It is from memory. In a radio talk, he was asked how he related his Christian faith to his work as a scientist. And he said something like that he felt it was rather like being a small dog accompanying its master on a golf course. Master was entirely happy that the dog should poke his nose down the odd rabbit hole as long as the dog followed when called. I want to begin by introducing the book on which I'm going to reflect today. No doubt many of you will have read it, but some of you not. The book arose from lectures to a general audience that were published later as Human Science and Human Dignity, which I shall refer to as Hesed, with apologies to Hebraists. It's the word for loving kindness. And these articulated a view of human nature that some have termed dual aspect monism, in which both the material events in the brain that can be observed by scientists and the experience of the person who owns the brain are aspects of a single entity. I have to say that I myself never heard Donald Makai use this term. I may be wrong, or maybe just that I missed it, but I suspect that this was deliberate, and that perhaps was because he was aware of some of the philosophical baggage that comes with it. For example, one can be asked what kind of stuff can possibly have these dual properties. In the Gifford Lectures he gave shortly before his death in 1987, which have already been referred to by Malcolm, He said that if forced to label his position, he would call it comprehensive realism, by which I believe he meant simply that both the scientific account of our brain at various levels and our first-person experience as owners of the brain are equally valid. He went on to say, if I remember correctly, and I apologize here that I've mislaid my copy of the book and couldn't check this, the first person, if he had to choose between these two accounts, the first person experience would take priority. And I agree with that for reasons I don't have time to go into. Incidentally, may I recommend to you, for a brief summary of Mackay's thinking, the article by Paul Helm, published in 1989. I discovered this by accident when preparing this talk, and it's really a very nice and fair summary of Donald's thinking on this and other issues. Now, Makai started by asking what motivates study of human science for those of us who are Christians. And the lectures start with this question, to which Makai gives the answer that it's part of the Genesis mandate to have dominion, understanding having dominion as being stewards, and more particularly, inasmuch as many bodily and mental ills afflict us, part of the Genesis mandate is to use our understanding of nature, and particularly of our own nature, to more effectively love our neighbours by seeking ways of ameliorating or curing their various physical and mental ills. Hesed ranges widely over a large number of specific issues raised by modern science, especially brain science. And there's not time in a short talk to consider specific issues, though please feel free to raise any in questions, and I shall instead concentrate on the main framework of thought from which Makai considered specific issues. This may seem an odd point to begin with, but I think I want to say that it was important to him that new knowledge is to be welcomed. He saw new knowledge as something to be welcomed, both as revealing more about God's creation and for its potential for addressing the many woes that still afflict us. He did not think that as believers in God and followers of Christ, we had any reason to fear new knowledge. If you want to put it in a slogan, it would be, all truth is God's truth. While he was alert to the effect of presuppositions on theological or anti-theological arguments, and certainly concerned to work out what it might mean to have a Christian mind, he thought that brothers, and they seem generally to be brothers rather than sisters, who took the view that modern science, particularly biology, was fundamentally at odds with Christian belief, were mistaken. His old friend Huygens from the Free University in Amsterdam has already been mentioned and was, I think, a major influence in this respect, combining a sympathy with the Kuiperian interest in seeking to articulate how Christian belief affected all of life, with a profound antipathy to the Dualistian view that there was one distinctively Christian way of thinking about any intellectual issue. One of Mackay's particular concerns was that Christians should not use a God of the gaps approach, where the proof of God's existence and activity was seen in what we could not explain. Sadly, since the 1970s, such views have, if anything, increased their hold amongst evangelicals. Could I at this point apologize that I'm reading, and I hope I'm not reading too quickly. I know it's difficult to follow a written text, but I don't trust myself to speak spontaneously in my current state. I want to move to a very key aspect of Donald's argument in Hesed and elsewhere, and that's the concept of levels of description or explanation of a complex entity. In biological science, one can distinguish between levels of description or explanation largely on the basis of scale. At the smallest scale, one can think biochemically. At the largest scale, one can think in terms of ecosystems or the biosphere. In neuroscience in particular, one may consider, for example, an intermediate level, brain activity at the level of the interactions in the intricate meshwork of interconnected nerve cells that are the brain's most obvious feature of the light microscope level. This is the sort of neuroscience I pursued for much of my career and is usually dubbed systems neuroscience. One can also focus down onto a smaller scale and consider the mechanisms by which single nerve cells function. Or one can focus further down on particular subcellular mechanisms, such as the channels in the walls of nerve cells, a very classic area of interest, partly because of the sensitivity of these channels to drugs, or on operation of the synapses by which one nerve cell communicates with the rest. One of Mackay's points is that in focusing at one level, one tends to lose sight of what's happening at other levels, and indeed this is sometimes deliberate. He also points out that there is, in some sense, a hierarchy of levels, roughly speaking, from the one concerned with the smallest events at the bottom to the one concerned with the largest events at the top. The key question is then, to what extent a description entirely at a lower level, assuming it were to be complete, would make superfluous descriptions at another level? To this question, Makai gave the resounding answer, no. I will mention in passing that this interest in levels of explanation is much broader than you might know. For example, my former colleague, the distinguished physiologist Dennis Noble, who has spent much of his career revealing the membrane channels that control the beating of the heart, has written a book called The Music of Life, in which he argues that no one level of biological explanation is to be preferred. Which one is appropriate depends on the kind of question one asks. One key question that arises, and this is the point at which I perhaps made the most specific comments I'll make in this talk, is that is our experience as conscious agents a level of description of ourselves in quite the same sense as we can talk about different levels of description of the biology? And I have some reservations about whether it is helpful to use the term level for the first-person perspective. Consider an example Makai gave to illustrate the way in which even an exhaustive description at a given level may miss the point. He considered a fire exit sign that at the level of electronics is nothing but red lights in particular position. Let's imagine it was the old-fashioned kind that said fire exit in red LEDs or some such. And notes that this description excludes the purpose of the fire sign and its meaning. I've used this illustration many times myself, but when I started to think about it in preparation for this talk, I came to the view that while it's a useful example of the difficulty of relating the meaning of a token to its physical realization, it's probably a mistake to think of the meaning of the sign as a level of description of the object. This is because there's no necessary link between the meaning and its physical realization. Let me spell this out in some detail. In the USA, in a few days, there's a congressional election likely to be hotly contested between the two main political parties. Let's imagine a town meeting, as the Americans call it, in which a straw vote is being taken, UK parliamentary fashion, by the voters walking through one of two doors, one red and one blue. And let's think about those doors as a kind of a different analogy to the fire exit one, but in the same category. In the USA, right-wing voters would go through the red door and left-wing voters through the blue. But in the UK, the opposite would happen, because conventionally the political left uses red as its colour, just the opposite to the US convention. So the meaning of the door colour sign depends on the convention the user uses to interpret it. Now, it seems to me that it follows that the meaning cannot be a level of description of the door per se. And to me, that suggests that the fire sign and similar analogies do not help as much as I once thought with the central issue of whether a complete biological account of brain function leaves logical room for the first-person perspective. I should say at this point that I'm treating the example as though it's rather more than an analogy, which of course is always limited, and it's actually what mathematicians would call a counterexample to the view that the materialist exhaustive view. I should say that I am nevertheless happy with Mackay's concept of the first-person perspective and the biological one as complementary. I don't want to go too much into that, though, because I think the crux of the view of what complementarity is comes through, or rather the specific support for it comes through the logical indeterminacy argument, and the following speaker is going to deal with that. Now, I just want to make some particular remarks about a particular argument in Hesed that I think is a little bit over-egged. Towards the end of the book, Makai makes the argument that, and I summarize loosely speaking here, that because changes in our thinking, habits, etc., are probably mediated by physical changes in what he called our internal switch settings, one can conclude that we need to be more careful than we otherwise would be with our thinking and habits. Now, this accords with the common view that if we can find an effect in our brains, then that's more objective than observations at the behavioral or experimental level. But I think it's at odds with Mackay's general views. And to give an example, isn't the evidence at the behavioral level that drinking a great deal of alcohol impairs one's ability to work and behave appropriately just as good grounds for moderation as seeing alcohol-induced damage to the brain itself? It may even be the case that knowledge at the behavioral level is more useful. I don't know if any of you know any drug addicts, but alas, we've had one in the family. And think of the discovery that in helping those addicted to drugs, it's valuable to remove not only the drugs themselves, but to take the user out of the places where they customarily took the drugs, presumably because there's a classical conditioned link between the environment and drug abuse. Now, while it would be very satisfying as a neuroscientist to track down the circuitry of the effect, practically speaking, what one needs to know is only that it occurs. So that's a small point. I want now to make some remarks about the reception and standing of Mackay's views. The view that he articulated both in Hesed and elsewhere has since had a mixed reception both in academia and amongst Christians. Determinists have persisted in asserting that a mechanistic account excludes others. Now, in academia, perhaps one important book to mention, although it doesn't directly cite Makai, is Bennett and Hacker's book on philosophical foundations of neuroscience. They argue that much of the key terminology of modern systems neuroscience is inappropriate and misleading because the terms apply properly only to abilities of a human as a whole. For instance, they object to the notion that neural activity might represent some feature of the world and that the brain processes information. For them, a map must be a visual image that a human observer finds useful and can't be something in the brain. Now, if valid, this would certainly have a negative effect on some of Mackay's arguments. I don't myself think that it's entirely valid, and that Hacker and Bennett seem to me to confound two rather different points. I think they're correct that premature claims have sometimes been made by neuroscientists about what might be correlates of a particular activity in brain structures. Let's think of the claim that the way some cells in the superior colliculus behave shows that they mediate spatial attention. And indeed, some neuroscientists have been equally cautious about that. It's very difficult to establish a tight correlation between conscious activity in humans and the mechanism that you think relates to it. What I think is less persuasive is their dogma, really, that terms like information can only be used in their original sense and cannot be generalized. Now let's move to evangelical Christianity. Some evangelical Christians hold similar views to Mackay's, and one can think of Malcolm Jeeves and co-authors, of course, Warren Brown, Nancy Murphy and collaborators, or Joel Green and others. What has been striking, especially in the USA, is the general trend towards a revival of the view in Mackay's day, probably supported largely by other theological traditions, that substance dualism is the only option for Christians. And one can think of people like J.P. Moreland and Ray and William Lane Craig, all at Biola, who have very vigorously defended the classical views. In particular, there's been what you might call a deliberate effort to teach philosophy in evangelical colleges in the US as though this was a must-believe doctrine. If you're not a substance dualist, then you must be an eliminative materialist. And indeed, there's a very well-written textbook by Moreland and Lane Craig that spends several chapters making this point, and incidentally doesn't even cite Makai. My impression is that this is part of a wider movement to seek a distinctively, quote, Christian system of thinking in opposition to and more or less comprehensively rejecting what is perceived as ungodly, quote, liberal thought. As many of you will know, probably the grandfather of this way of thinking was the Dutch systematic thinker Duyveerd, but in more recent times, the philosopher Arwin Plantinga, who is still alive, is probably the main figure, though I hasten to say that he has not written, as far as I know, on human nature, other than advocating a rather doubtful argument for the incompatibility of evolution and rationality. Now, one specific criticism was made by Dempsky, better known as an influential advocate of intelligent design, though he's now abandoned work on that subject. After Mackay's death, Dempsky pounced on a sentence in Human Science and Human Dignity as to him showing that Mackay believed in supervenience, a term particularly associated with the philosopher Kim and regarded as a variety of materialism. Indeed, Dempsky described Mackay as a semi-materialist. I might mention that I said this to a conservative evangelical friend of mine who spent much of his life discipling graduate students. And he said after a pause for thought, well, if Donald Makai is a semi-materialist, then I guess I am too. And Oliver Berkeley wrote a response to Dempsky in Science and Christian Belief. My own view is that Dempsky took the remark out of context, and it's not too difficult to find evidence in other publications of Makai that he had a more nuanced view of the issue. I certainly remember him as being cautious about making any dogmatic statements about ontological issues. In conclusion, if one believes, as Makai did and I do, that it's a mistake to base our understanding of ourselves on dualist views of human nature, then it's clear that we have work to do to help our brothers and sisters see why we take this position. Whatever our views, we can agree on our purpose in this life being to glorify our Maker, and that we all look forward to enjoying him forever in the new creation. And may I apologize if that's been very hard to follow, and I don't usually read papers, so I'm sorry that I did on this occasion, and I'll take questions.
Thank you, Jack. And Stuart, I know you've got lights glaring into your eyes, so it's Bob Wright here.
Yes, I can see you, Bob. Thank you.
I just wanted to ask you about your levels of description.
Yeah.
I think a modern way of saying that would be emergence, but is emergence different? Because emergence depends on the layer below in some ways. But perhaps you can talk about that.
Bob asks a good point. Am I talking about emergence? And the answer is, my difficulty with emergence is it's what I would call a term that's a hunting license. In other words, you don't really know how emergence might work, and it's just a label to cover an area of ignorance. So I don't myself make much use of it. But yes, I think emergence is one way of thinking about all such views as Makai's and mine. I can't say more than that in my current slightly foggy mental state. Sorry.
Okay, so there's a question here.
Could you spell out a bit more sort of nature of the controversy here? Because some of us are a bit too young to remember all of that. So supervenience, what was the problem there, if you like? What were people accusing Donald Makai of?
Okay. What supervenience means to Kim and others who've used it is that you have one body of facts, let's say the biochemistry of the brain, and you have another body of facts, let's say the brain described at the level of activity of neurons and their connection. And the latter is supervenient on the former if, but let me check the exact definition. But broadly speaking, the latter supervenes on the former if and only if some difference in Y is necessary for any difference in X to be possible. So it's a good question whether the view that Makai advocated does involve supervenience, but it really was an argument from an individual sentence in Hesed where Makai was trying to make a point which was really more particular. So he was saying something like that there are patterns of activity in the brain to which there's no conscious correlate. But that on the other hand, in his view, all conscious experience has a correlate. So Dempsky said, oh, that's supervenience, that's a sort of materialism. Well, so what? But so that's the basic specifics of the argument.
Okay, Zach.
Thank you. It struck me that the analogy that you kind of implicitly draw between, say, intelligent design and evolution and dualism versus maybe dual aspect monism or something, I think that's just a really interesting analogy, and the kind of Biola school of thought, setting these things up as kind of opposites, and Christians should choose the one that's kind of rejected by mainstream science. I wondered, has there always been the split between the kind of dominant American evangelical approach to these things and what you find in British Christians in science circles, or was there more unity back in, say, the 1960s? Is this a recent development, or has it always kind of been a split?
Well, first of all, I'm not a historian of ideas, so I'm talking about impressions here. I think that it is no secret that a bunch of philosophers in the US took a very adversarial position and set out to make some kind of dualism a must-have doctrine for thinking Christians. So, as I understand it, it's really been led by philosophers, and of course Makai was a scientist. I mean, he was a competent philosopher, but he made no attempt to survey the whole range of philosophical opinions on any one issue. And he also, I think, was rather mindful of the fact that philosophy can be very speculative on the one hand, and on the other hand, it can be very nitpicking. And that's a different perspective of a scientist, because a scientist, yes, he has to be careful about the clear meaning of terms, but ultimately scientific terms always have an operational sense. So semantic confusions that may worry a philosopher don't always have any practical consequences for the scientist. So I'm trying to be a bit cautious here, because one of the things I don't like about some of the people in what you might call the Biola tradition is they're very, very combative. So some years ago I watched William Lane Craig debate on TV with Lewis Walpole, who's a very distinguished biologist and an agnostic. And I'm afraid Brother Lane Craig was just belligerent. And Walpole was trying to make quite simple points, like he didn't know whether there was a God or not. And Lane Craig was trying to say, oh, that makes you a practical atheist. So we need to avoid that kind of, in my view, we need to avoid that kind of adversarial approach and take the view, say, of another forum, the Trinity Forum, which is that courtesy is a must-have characteristic for Christian arguments. So as I gave this talk, I'm trying to say both I know where I stand and where Makai stood, but I'm very aware that there are other views, and I think we'll probably get some expressed in this discussion.
Would you accept that there could be other forms of dualist interactionism than substance dualism, which assumes that the mind's a substance? I mean, Popper and Eccles, for example.
Okay. I have always been puzzled by how a philosopher as acute as Popper could go for what seemed to me to be a quite loose concept. But the extent to which I agree with Popper and Eccles is that one way that Makai put his view was duality without dualism. So I think we can agree that there are two radically different kinds of streams of evidence about who we are, the experiential and everything else for the sake of simplicity, the distinction I'd make in dualism is whether one is a Cartesian or an Aristotelian substance dualist. And I confess I've never completely understood another kind of dualism which is currently also fashionable, which is the one that Aquinas advocated, where the soul seems to be, on the one hand, like Aristotle's soul, which is, it's tied to the physical embodiment of the body, and it's whatever gives the body form. So, loosely speaking, the genetic code could be the form, and the traditional kind of dualism where the mind or the soul is a different kind of stuff. I'm not sure I've answered your question.
What's just the word stuff? Could you have an interactionism without them both being substances?
Well, I think my take on that is that the concept of stuff is itself actually difficult, and that one thing that dualists and non-dualists need to think about together is whether we're disagreeing about something we could agree about, which is that statements about our thinking and our feeling and our intentions are in different logical categories from statements about our brain. That's certainly Mackay's view and mine, and that is a sort of duality. So maybe one way of putting it technically is, are you a property dualist or a substantial dualist? And yes, some sympathy with property dualism, if I correctly understand that. Thank you, Paul.
Okay, if we just take one from the back here, from Dennis first.
Thank you, Stuart, very much. Just a comment and a question. The comment was simply coming back to American philosophy, just to say there's going to be a Faraday Institute seminar that's coming Tuesday by philosopher Chris Oldfield, which is a critique of Alvin Plantinga's views about naturalism. So I thought that might be an interest just for people to know that. 1 o'clock. It's online on Tuesday. The question actually, coming away from all this technical and highbrow philosophy back to daily life, I just wondered, and you may not want to answer this question, but you mentioned at the beginning that it was during your time as a PhD student in Donald Mackay's laboratory that you recovered your Christian faith. I would be intrigued to know, was that through intellectual argument? Was it a particular... I'd just be intrigued to know a little bit more about that, how that happened in practice, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about that. Thank you.
Dennis, that's a lovely question, and thank you so much. I appreciate that. Well, I mean, there are several people in this room who probably know how this event looked from the outside, so to speak, but I think I'd become cynical about Christian things and very sort of skeptical. Donald Makai patiently listened to my complaints and did his best to answer the intellectual issues. But the way I've usually described it is I became aware that I didn't have a very good argument against returning to the faith of my childhood, and that perhaps that was part of what Christians meant by sin, that one didn't want to acknowledge one's debt to and dependence on one's creator because it would constrain one's life choices. And so that was uncomfortable. And then the turning point for me was, I can't remember exactly what I was doing, but it sort of suddenly hit me one evening, I think it was evening, that if Christ had died for my hostility, because of my hostility to God, then I owed him something. And so that was a conditional. It wasn't immediately believing it was all true again, but that was enough to send me to pray that God, please reveal or re-reveal yourself to me, that I may serve you if you're there to be served. And I found that what I wanted to do changed, and so if you like to speak in Wesley's terms, my heart was warmed. So it wasn't, there was an intellectual ground clearing, but the conversion itself was much more to do with what I've always understood as the core of any kind of Christian faith, which is the belief that Christ has done something for us that no one else could, that we needed done to make us right with God, and that set us off seeking to live to his glory thereafter. So thank you very much for giving me a chance to say that. I think Peter's been trying to say something for a while here. And
sorry, I'm just aware we've got a question coming in from the online people, if you don't mind a question from them.
No.
We've got a question from Ian that says, please can you explain a little bit more about the possible shortcomings of the analogy of the electric sign, please?
Okay, the point I've tried to make is that there's a sort of disconnect between the meaning of a sign and its physical realization, and that's quite simple. And in Makai thought quite carefully about meaning and the physical world, and it's because meaning is what is intended by the speaker and what is heard by the listener may be two different things, and there may be a conventional meaning in between those, so to speak. So the correlate of the meaning of the sign is not purely in the sign, it's in the combination of the sign and the preconceptions of those looking at it. And therefore, the meaning of the sign is not purely a property of the object itself. It can't be a level of description of the object. It's a level of description of the whole environment. So to take a very loose analogy, if you think about arguments based on the second law of thermodynamics, it's terribly important to remember not only the entropy change in the object of consideration, but also the environmental entropy change. Yep.
Okay, I think this is going to be our last question so that we go to our break on time.
Well, this is really just a brief comment, and I don't know what our speaker will think of what I'm going to say about a previous
Neither do I at the
question,
moment.
And that is about America. America is a very varied place.
Indeed.
And Americans are not afraid to disagree with each other. The British tend to be a little bit polite, but I think that what the Richard Dawkins period has shown us is that we must be willing to speak up and disagree with each other.
Here. So I'm trying to say debate, vigorous discussion, but not kind of parliamentary raucous debate. Incidentally, I didn't mention that my distinguished colleague Dennis Noble has a wonderful and very telling put down of Dawkins' basic point, which is he took in his book, The Music of Life, he took Dawkins' purple passage about selfish genes and us being slaves to them, and he inverted all the logic so that instead of us being slaves to our genes, it's the other way around, and asked Dawkins, how would you know whether your view or the alternative is correct? And Dawkins said, I don't think I do. And that, of course, is basically a telling Popperian argument that what Dawkins is doing in that argument is not science. So, yeah, I've got friends who have studied at Biola, and I look forward to debating with them. if I just quickly mention something I deliberately didn't put in the talk, probably Donald Mackay's most contentious views were that he did not think that the early embryo had the status of a person, and he did not think, therefore, that early abortion was murder, and he had similarly cautious views about the end of life. And that's a light the firework response to many of our brethren. So there is, that is one of the reasons, I think, why some Americans don't cite Donald Mackay, that it's end of life and early life issues are so polarized in the States that, you know, you go into outer darkness if you have views like mine and Donald's.
Okay.
Sorry, they want to send you into it. They can't send us into outer darkness, but thank you for your patience, and I'm sorry I wasn't really on my best form at all.
If you'd like to join a round of applause. Thank you for bringing such interesting points and also such a personal nature to answering the questions there at the end. We're going to enter a time of a break now, so we've got half an hour to go to the bookstore. We've got tea and coffee, have time to chat, and we'll be joining back at 12:10 to hear Professor George Cockhill. So thank you.